Hello, my name is Phil Polari. I'm a double major in political science and philosophy at Ramapo College of New Jersey, and I'm going to be presenting my paper entitled Nozick, Rawls, and the Innocent Bystander Problem, an Analysis of Reparations. John Rawls and Robert Nozick were political philosophers at Harvard. Nozick's libertarianism provides readers with an insightful rebuttal to the shortcomings of Rawls's libertarianism. Despite the appearance of animosity towards the form of distributive justice Rawls proposes, it is a common misconception that the two men were opposites on all issues. This paper will juxtapose Rawls and Nozick's theories of justice in light of Ta-Nehisi Coates' now famous argument in favor of reparations for African Americans. It will begin with a brief discussion of the historical literature that contextualizes the issues of housing discrimination in Chicago. I will continue by applying those facts to the rules set out by both Rawls and Nozick. The subsequent section of this paper will discuss why Nozick provides a better justification for reparations while critiquing his main shortcoming, which I call the innocent bystander problem. There has been scholarly discussion of reparations for African Americans since 1968. More recently, Democratic politicians have started advocating in favor of the issue. The most famous and elaborate discussion of reparations came from Ta-Nehisi Coates in his 2014 article, The Case for Reparations. Coates opens his article by chronicling the discrimination African Americans faced. He discusses how Jim Crow laws in Mississippi forced people of color into the margins, including through the illegitimate seizure of land from people of color by terrorists and the government. He continues by discussing the predatory lending schemes that targeted people of color that were termed contract selling. Coates finishes the first portion of his paper discussing redlining. Redlining was a process whereby the federal government refused to insure mortgages in some economically depressed areas in major American cities. The government insured these mortgages in these areas if, and only if, said mortgages had shorter terms and higher interest rates than typical loans. These areas were disproportionately African American, and it prevented people of color from obtaining the mortgages necessary to purchase a home. This forced African Americans in Chicago to purchase their homes with predatory contracts. Contract selling was the term given to the predatory contracts African Americans used to purchase homes. It was a policy whereby a real estate agent would buy a house and sell it with a contract stipulating a payment plan. Unlike traditional mortgages, these contracts would allow for the seizure of the property with a single missed payment, and the buyer would have no recourse. The buyer never became the legal owner of the home. These practices were designed to earn white real estate brokers massive amounts of money without allowing people of color to earn equity in their homes. African Americans were faced with animosity when they attempted to integrate white neighborhoods. Blockbusters, people who sold homes to African Americans, would warn white homeowners that their homes would decrease in value with the arrival of African Americans. Home prices sharply decreased as a result of this practice, which hurts the homeowners when they tried to sell their homes, further enraging the white homeowners. The resulting animosity was directed at African Americans, who were blamed for the loss of equity in the homes owned by white families. Coates argues that this type of discrimination did not make people of color less than white people. Instead, it rendered people of color incapable of participating in the American economy. The legacy of this practice is a situation where neighborhoods of color are, as Coates puts it, on the wrong end of virtually every socioeconomic indicator. Redlined neighborhoods have poor unemployment numbers, wealth metrics, and crime statistics. Coates concedes that African Americans have better lives today than in the 1900s, but he argues that this progress is not sufficient to eliminate the legacy of housing discrimination. People of color are less wealthy on average than whites because they were not able to purchase homes that would have allowed them to build their wealth. This makes people of color unable to leave the poor neighborhoods that they inhabit, which creates a cycle of poverty that cannot be escaped. Because of these inherent inequalities, Coates argues that we must push for reparations. Without them, Coates claims, we cannot move on from the legacy of Jim Crow and achieve true equality. Immanuel Kant discussed his conception of a just society regularly in his works on practical and social philosophy. He was unable, however, to complete a full work on a just society before his death. Rawls sought to complete this unfinished work in his book, A Theory of Justice. In order to properly conceive of a just society, Rawls created the original position. The original position is an imaginary realm in which people would come together to create a just society. Members of the original position would have a veil of ignorance. This veil of ignorance would result in us lacking an understanding of every major characteristic about ourselves. We would not know our gender, intelligence, level of lifetime success, strength, or social status. This would be done so that we could all act in a just way to those who are less fortunate than us, while still acting in our own self-interest. The original position would be considered the point at which justice lies and the direction towards which society should always strive. Society is just if and only if the social institutions in that society fulfill the principles set forth in the original position. Assuming that all persons in the original position are acting in their rational self-interest, two general principles would be formulated. The first is that we would all have equal rights at the highest attainable level while respecting the rights of others. The second is that socioeconomic inequalities would be structured in a way to benefit everyone in the most advantageous way possible. The first formulation of the general principle of justice stipulated that political liberties, private property, and the freedom from arbitrary arrest were all basic rights to be guaranteed to all citizens. These rights could only be curtailed if the rights of one citizen were abrogated when another exercised their rights. For example, the right to own slaves as private property would be curtailed because another human's rights would be abrogated. The second formulation of this principle stipulated that the distribution of income and wealth must be structured in a way that is most advantageous to the weakest members of society. Wealth need not be distributed equally. A society in which the richest has $10 trillion in wealth and the poorest has $500 would be more just than a society in which all citizens have $100 in wealth. It is further required by this principle that upward socioeconomic mobility be attached to positions of power open to all members of a society. A society would be unjust if some members of said society were not granted the right to full participation in said society. According to Coates, Chicago during the era of housing discrimination was not a just Rawlsian society. The contract sellers and redliners abrogated the right of people of color to own private property. The fact that governmental institutions allowed such discrimination to occur further proves that society during this period was unjust. According to Rawls, just societies do not allow this to occur, and their governmental institutions would present such discrimination. Coates claims that the redlined neighborhoods in Chicago are, quote, on the wrong end of virtually every socioeconomic indicator, unquote. They have murder and infant mortality rates that are far above both the national average and citywide average. The redlined populations of Chicago also have abnormally large populations below the poverty line and using welfare benefits. Rawls's philosophical opponents, might argue that this does not imply the injustice of a society according to Rawls. They are correct in their assertion that wealth inequality is not unjust in a Rawlsian society. However, their argument requires a philosophically uncharitable reading of Coates' article in order for their argument to be logically cogent. There is an unstated conclusion in Coates' argument. The policies that currently exist, are not structured in a way that is most advantageous to the weakest members of society. Coates' lamentation of segregated Chicago as the second ghetto implies that society was structured in a way to harm the weakest members of society, thus violating Rawls' second formulation of the principle upon which a just society is formed. If implemented properly, reparations would rectify these injustices. The transfer of wealth, whether it be through tax credits, cash deposits, or the granting of property, would give people of color the ability to own private property, a right that was abrogated during the era of housing discrimination in Chicago. Because Chicagoans in the formerly redlined neighborhoods are also among the weakest in American society, reparations would create a society that is structured in such a way that is most advantageous for said members of society. Rawls' philosophical opponents might argue that this proposal violates his first formulation of the general principle of justice. They would argue that the seizure and redistribution of private property, whether it be through taxation or eminent domain, would violate the basic right of all citizens to own private property. This argument requires an incorrect reading of the first formulation of the general principle of justice. Rawls states that the rights of one individual cannot abrogate the rights of others. By racially discriminating against people of color, the contract sellers and redliners abrogated the right of people of color to own private property. It follows that the property that was gained and distributed as a result of these practices do not rightfully belong to the contract sellers and mortgage lenders. Rawls would therefore argue that redistributive practices are just. Nozickian libertarianism argues that there is only a limited role for the state. Nozick argues that there are actions in which the state cannot engage without violating our rights. Because of this, Nozick argues for a state that exists solely to prevent fraud, theft, illegitimate uses of violence, and similar violations of natural rights. It logically follows that a government whose conduct extends beyond those actions is unjust. Those who are attracted to Nozickian libertarianism would therefore be opposed to wealth redistribution, for which Coates calls. Policies that require the distribution of wealth from one group to another require taxation to achieve their goal. Since these people argue that taxation is theft, a state pursuing a policy goal that requires taxation is abrogating the rights of its citizens. While this is a reasonable view for libertarians to hold, it ignores the premise upon which Nozick set his ideal society. In order for a society to be just, there must be justice in holdings. Three criteria must be met for a holding to be just. The first criteria is that the property is obtained through a just acquisition. This principle refers to how the property is obtained by the first owner. If Bob and Joe are competing to buy a plot of land, it would be just for Bob to buy the land by outbidding Joe. It would not, however, be just if Bob murdered Joe in an attempt to remove his only competition from the market. The second criteria is that the property is obtained through a just transfer. This principle refers to how the property is bought and sold. If Bob sells this hypothetical plot of land to Greg through a legitimate and consensual transaction, then the principle has been followed. If Greg scams Bob into selling the land, then Greg has violated this principle. The final criteria is that the property has never been involved in a transaction that violates either of the aforementioned principles. If, at any point in history, the above criteria have been violated, all future transfers of the aforementioned plot of land would be unjust. It is therefore morally imperative that the government rectify these injustices. Critical to the satisfaction of this criteria is that there need not be a current injustice to which we can point for there to have been a violation of this principle. Rather, what matters is that there be an injustice at some point in history that is currently causing suffering for a group of people. Coates does not discuss the original purchase of the property in question, so there is no way to determine whether or not Nozick's first principle of just holdings was violated. There is, however, discussion regarding the transfer of said properties. Predatory lending is a form of fraud designed to prevent people from owning a home. Therefore, the second principle of a just holding of property has been violated. Nozick's philosophical opponents might argue that this is irrelevant to determining whether or not Coates' plan for reparations is just. They would argue that homes that have been bought and sold in the preceding years could still have been justly transferred, making the holding of the property just. It would therefore be unjust to redistribute the property at issue, according to Nozick's opponents. Nozick's philosophical opponents are ignoring his third criteria for a just holding of property. Nozick requires that the principle of just transfer never be violated throughout the chain of custody of the property. Because the principle of just transfer was violated through the fraud against the families of color, that property can never be justly transferred again. The fact that the property was justly transferred in the subsequent years is a red herring for this analysis. Nozick would therefore require that the justice be rectified. Nozick requires that governments rectify these injustices by determining how society would look had the injustice not occurred, and then actualizing that determination. Coates' plan for reparations seeks to create a society that would replicate how American society would look had African Americans not suffered injustices. It therefore follows that Coates' plan to rectify injustice would align with a Nozickian libertarian conception of justice. Nozick and Rawls both provide compelling justifications for reparations. It is a laudable goal to rectify systemic oppression. Nozick, however, provides a more just solution to the reparations issue. The Nozickian argument is bolstered by a need to rectify the abrogation of rights. It does not focus on the level of suffering experienced by a given group. In a Nozickian system, Oprah Winfrey would receive the same remuneration as a family that was never financially able to leave a redlined neighborhood. It provides equal compensation for equal suffering. My philosophical opponents might argue that this is not materially different from the way Rawls would handle the issue. They would cite the fact that Rawls also laid out basic rights that could not be violated. My philosophical opponents are correct in their assertions. However, they miss an important aspect of Rawlsian justice, strengthening the weakest in society. Rawls believed that societies were just when the weakest members in society are the strongest. This provides an unjust framework for reparations. A just society provides equal compensation for equal suffering. Rawlsian reparations would not provide that. Rawls would provide a lesser degree of reparations to Winfrey than our hypothetical family in a redlined neighborhood. They would argue that the family in a redlined neighborhood is suffering worse impacts than Winfrey. That is true. However, the impacts of an action do not change the injustice of that action. I believe justice cannot properly be applied appropriately from a consequentialist perspective. It focuses less on the act of immorality or injustice and more on the impacts of that action. When we focus more on the consequences than the action, we ignore the relative turpitude of that action. The fact that Winfrey was able to overcome the impacts of housing injustices does not diminish the injustice she faced. By taking a deontological approach to justice, we can rectify injustices and immorality while acknowledging the relative moral turpitude of an action. Because the Nozickian argument is more deontological than the Rawlsian argument, it is more just. The logical extension of the principle I elucidated earlier is that just societies punish equal injustices equally. Those who took part in the housing discrimination should be punished proportionally to the actions in which they engaged. Those who did not should not be punished. This is the greatest shortcoming of the Nozickian argument and the argument for reparations in total. There might be people who hold property that would have belonged to an African American if housing discrimination did not occur. They would be in violation of the third criteria for justice and holdings, regardless of their complicity in housing discrimination. Because of this, Nozick would argue that it is just to redistribute their property to a victim of housing discrimination. I disagree. I believe Nozick's third principle of justice and holding wrongly punishes innocent bystanders to housing discrimination. Any non-victim who did not actively engage in redlining and contract selling was an innocent bystander to the injustices. My philosophical opponents would likely argue that the people I call innocent bystanders benefited from housing discrimination. They would claim that the innocent bystanders should not be allowed to benefit from an unjust practice. My philosophical opponents are using a consequentialist approach to justice, whose flaws I have previously elucidated. In this situation, the impact of the action is preventing my philosophical opponents from analyzing the relative turpitude of the action. Buying a home in a legal, consensual way is not unjust. Discriminating against African Americans is unjust. Instead of punishing people en masse because they hold property that would have belonged to someone else, we should be taking an individualized approach to reparations. The only people who deserve to be remunerated are those who suffered from housing discrimination. The only people who should be published are those who engaged in the discrimination. My philosophical opponents would argue that there are innocent bystanders that are harmed by these practices. They would likely cite Coates's lamentation of the socioeconomic status of African Americans as a result of housing discrimination. It is true that some innocent bystanders are harmed as a result of housing discrimination, especially the children of victims of housing discrimination. This argument, however, is based on an unsubstantiated premise. There is an implicit claim that the lack of housing discrimination would have resulted in socioeconomic parity for all races. Coates does not provide evidence for that in his article. Because there is no evidence provided to determine the socioeconomic status that African American children would hold, we cannot justly provide reparations to them because it violates the principle of equal compensation for equal suffering. In this paper, I juxtaposed the political philosophies of Robert Nozick and John Rawls. My paper began with a brief discussion of why Coates argues that we need to provide reparations to African Americans. I continue by applying Rawlsian and Nozickian principles of justice to the issue of reparations. I argue that Nozick provides a more just framework for rectifying housing discrimination due to its deontological nature. My last discussion critiques the argument for reparations for its failure to solve the innocent bystander problem. I believe that it is unjust to punish those who were innocent bystanders to an injustice. Thank you very much.